Everyone, please take your seats. The table is set with the finest china, worthy of a true Sunday supper, when families gather to share hearty home-cooked meals. It's time to resurrect the forgotten feasts of Sundays past. Grab your fork and join the feast. Tomato aspic is a sort of Jell-O juice hybrid. And no, we're not even going to attempt to justify that one. Picture this: a squishy, gelatinous tomato mass on the plate, glistening as if it is ready for a 1960s cookbook. This dish was the crown jewel of Sunday supper tables for decades, and it came topped with the pièce de résistance, a nice big spoonful of mayonnaise. It wasn't just the texture of aspic that brought the dish to fame. It was a dish that said, "I know my way around a kitchen," because making one required skill. Tomato juice was mixed with gelatin and the right proportion of other ingredients such as Worcestershire sauce, onion, and celery. Once prepared, it was portioned like a cake and could be eaten as a first course or as an accompaniment. People loved to bring it to Sunday parties because it seemed very elegant and could be prepared in advance. But let's be real, its wobbling appeal was polarizing. You either thought it was the bomb.com because it was the perfect mix of sour and salty, or you were like, "Meh, I'll take the beans, please." Tomato aspic is now best known as a joke, but it was a popular dish when gelatin was the go-to ingredient in many recipes. Nostalgic or nightmarish? That's for you to decide. This jellied chicken salad is the best example of how mid-century cooking can be preserved in aspic. It is the kind of thing that happens when someone asks, "How can we make chicken salad even more vintage?" Oh, I know. Add gelatin. This dish starts innocently enough: chicken, celery, and mayonnaise. But then things take a turn. And then there is unflavored gelatin, which takes the basic salad and turns it into a wobbling tower of savory aspiration. It's kind of like a Jell-O with meat, but instead of having fruit flavors, it has poultry. The jellied chicken salad was the highlight of Sunday dinners, which, placed in its mold, was displayed on the table. Why? Because it was associated with elegance, or so home chefs thought at the time. It was cold, very manageable, and ideal for making portions for many people. Also, it went well with crackers or a crisp lettuce leaf for that extra special gourmet look. It may not be photogenic today, but jellied chicken salad was at least functional in its context. The gelatin helped to preserve the chicken, and because the meat can be molded easily, it was perfect for potlucks and buffets. Today's people may not fancy it, but there is no doubt that this dish is innovative. It is a relic of a time when people were obsessed with gelatin and a fun conversation piece for anyone willing to attempt it. Milk toast was the best comfort food before macaroni and cheese became the king of all comfort foods. This dish, which was as easy as it was old-fashioned, was one of those that families who preferred comfort to glamour would cook for Sunday supper. Here's how it worked. Pieces of bread were baked until they became golden brown and then soaked in warm milk. On top of it, butter was spread liberally, and at times a dash of sugar or cinnamon was also sprinkled. The outcome was a soft, cozy meal that could be described as a hug in a plate. Milk toast was not only a meal, it was a tradition. It was given to kids, the elderly, or anyone who had a cold, and it was the food equivalent of a warm blanket. Though it may not look like much by today's standards, back then it was a luxury to have when ingredients were rationed and money was even more limited. What is interesting is that milk toast has sunk to oblivion, which is rather surprising given the fact that it was popular in the past. Perhaps it is too simple for today's taste buds, or perhaps it is just that we have lost touch with how good simple food can be. In either case, milk toast deserves a second chance, or at least a second glance, for anyone who wants to take a trip back in time and sample a dish that is as mild as it is meaningful. If you thought that meatloaf was the most divided dish, let me present to you its distant relative, liver loaf. This dish was the answer to the question, "What do we do with all this liver?" of the 1950s. Spoiler, they shaped it into a solid loaf and then proceeded to smother it in thick brown sauce. It was the epitome of the all-in-one meal that sought to get as much nutrition as possible and then some out of a piece of offal. The ingredients were basic, but not plain at all. The liver was raw and minced and mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, onions, and only a pinch of spices to cover the raw smell of the liver. Baked to a golden brown, it resembled a meatloaf, but when it came out of the oven, it smelled like liver. The gravy was mandatory. Its richness was meant to complement or mask the assertiveness of the loaf. The liver loaf had its followers, especially children who grew up during the Depression and the Second World War, when organ meats were cheap and rich in iron. But it also had its critics, usually young members of the family frowning at the table while Grandpa was telling stories about the great past. Today, the liver loaf is considered to be a kind of gastronomic antique. It may not sit on the modern Sunday table, but it is a perfect example of innovative and frugal cuisine. Who knows? Perhaps it is time for a return to the 80s. It's a quiet Sunday at the dinner table, and you're ready to dig into a plate of golden brown codfish cakes with creamy peas. This meal wasn't just a dish back in the day. It was a solution to tough times. Codfish cakes, made with salted cod, mashed potatoes, and a little seasoning, were a frugal way to turn pantry staples into something special. The creamy peas, a luxury addition that made you forget you were eating on a budget. The real MVP of this recipe was salted cod, which could sit in the pantry forever and still come to life with a good soak. The cakes were fried up crispy on the outside and soft on the inside, like edible comfort. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. On the other hand, creamed peas made a basic veggie rich and buttery. They balanced each other out like the perfect culinary couple. This isn't a meal that gets lost in the shuffle, and it's the kind of dish that makes you want to call your grandparents and ask for their secret recipe, then spend the evening wondering how a simple can of peas and some codfish could taste so good. Just think about eating fluffy and warm bread and getting a delicious combination of spiced meat and soft cabbage instead. You know, something that is just perfect for comfort food, right? Meat and cabbage pockets were the quiet stars of the classic Sunday dinner that could be eaten with the help of two hands while being warm and enveloped in the embrace of dough. Favorite with farming families and immigrant populations, these tiny morsels offered both cheap and hearty meals for many people, for the cost of a $5 or less. The filling was a basic but enchanting mixture of ground beef, onions, cabbage, and a pinch of salt, pepper, and occasionally caraway seeds. It was a hand-rolled dough, which was then folded around the mixture before being baked to a golden brown. These pockets were not only tasty, they were useful. They could be prepared beforehand, warmed up for the second time, or placed into a basket for a picnic. While they may have a cousin in the modern empanadas or pierogies, there was something special about beef and cabbage pockets. These were the main dishes of any family dinner, gone before the Jell-O mold even got on the table. Today, they are a reminder of the past when Sunday supper was a tradition of coming together for a good meal and people. Yes, pork cake is as literal as it gets and as strange as it sounds. No, it's not a dessert. Imagine meatloaf and fruitcake got together and decided to create something truly unforgettable. A rich, meaty bread containing pork and spices, slightly sweet. Pork cake was a Sunday dinner in the South, the sort of dish that made your neighbors look at you funny and your relatives beg for the recipe. The name was as unusual as the ingredients used in preparing the food. In a bowl, ground pork was combined with breadcrumbs, eggs, and spices such as cloves and nutmeg. Some recipes even contained a hint of molasses or brown sugar to give an extra hint of sweetness to the savory. The loaf was baked until firm and then sliced and served with gravy, or for the more adventurous, a side order of applesauce. You must be wondering why anyone would go to the trouble of making a pork cake. Well, it was a good means of extending meat since one could only afford a small piece of meat, but had enough beans to make it go around. Besides, it was very spicy, which was quite different from the usual meatloaf that I am used to eating. It was filling, surprising, and, to be quite frank, peculiar, but peculiar in a good sort of way. Today, pork cake has nearly vanished from tables, but remains in the recipe books of those who enjoy retro foods. Whether you like it or not, it is a piece of history that needs to be discussed when it comes to our culinary world, or at least for the controversy it brings. Don't worry, no rabbits were harmed in the making of Welsh rabbits. This misnamed dish was ooey gooey cheese sauce poured over toast and comfort food that made Sunday supper feel like a cozy celebration. The name is from the 18th century British humor that gave it the name poor man's meat. But the flavor? Rich and satisfying. The real star was the cheese sauce, made with sharp cheddar, mustard, and sometimes a splash of beer or Worcestershire. Once it bubbled up and got all melty, it turned a simple slice of toast into something decadent. It was cheap, quick to whip up, and downright indulgent, and families loved it. Welsh rabbit was also a good way to get rid of the cheese drawer, which, let's be honest, is the most underrated kitchen space. These days, it's basically a fancy cousin of cheese fondue, but back then it was a lifesaver for families trying to stretch their groceries. It still holds up today. Serve it with a side salad or a dollop of chutney, and you've got a meal. Here's a sandwich that knew how to spice up Sunday supper. Soft white bread with a crunchy side of celery hearts, and deviled ham. Deviled ham is ham with an attitude, spiced, minced, and mixed with mayo or mustard for a creamy spread that's as packed a punch as it is. In the mid-20th century, canned deviled ham was a pantry staple, often sold in those tiny paper-wrapped tins. Salty, tangy, personality-loaded, it was spread thickly on bread and served with crisp celery hearts as a light, tasty meal. The celery wasn't for show, it was the perfect crunch to help balance the richness of the ham. It wasn't the kind of Sunday supper you spent hours cooking, but it was good. It was a little spicy, kids loved it, adults loved it because it was effortless, and everyone loved it because it was delicious. Deviled ham has pretty much faded into history, but its memory lives on in retro recipe books and maybe in your grandparents' memories. Hot water cornbread wasn't a dish, it was a Southern tradition. This skillet-fried bread was simple but divine, made with just cornmeal, hot water, and a pinch of salt. It was crispy on the edges, soft in the middle, and toasty in flavor that was hard to resist. Until you paired it with buttermilk gravy, it was next-level Southern comfort. Creamy, tangy, and often with a bit of bacon grease or sausage drippings for extra flavor. Buttermilk gravy was the rule. The cornbread was a sponge, and every last drop was soaked up, and each bite was a piece of heaven. It wasn't fancy food, but it was soul food all the way. Hot water cornbread was cheap, quick to make, and incredibly versatile, and it was popular. Whatever you served it with, it could be breakfast, dinner, or dessert. It's not as common anymore, but for those who grew up with it, it's still a favorite. You're missing out on a Southern classic that needs a revival if you've never tried it. Let's talk about a dish that was basically the Beyoncé of mid-century Sunday suppers. Chicken a la king. Tender pieces of chicken swimming in a creamy sauce with mushrooms, peas, and sometimes a little sherry for that fancy touch. Pile that goodness onto a warm, flaky biscuit, and you've got a meal that can even cheer up the grumpiest of family members. Chicken a la king wasn't just food, it was an event. But moms everywhere whipped it up to show off their cooking skills and use up leftover chicken. It made the rounds on dinner tables, at potlucks, and even at a church social. Some trace its roots to New York's Delmonico's restaurant in the late 1800s, but by the time the mid-century rolled around, it was a full-blown household staple. So why did it disappear? Maybe because we collectively decided carbs on carbs were too much. Spoiler, they're not. Or maybe it's because pre-made biscuits fell out of fashion, and suddenly this creamy dream was consigned to the history books. Chicken a la king deserves another shot. Hearty, comforting, and endlessly customizable. It's a great dish. When you have leftover chicken, or crave something cozy, channel those 1950s vibes and whip this up. Trust me, it'll feel like a time machine to comfort town. Salmon loaf probably doesn't sound glamorous, but in the day, it was the pride of every thrifty household. Canned salmon, cheap and shelf-stable, breadcrumbs, eggs, and a few secret seasonings, and voila! You've got a loaf that's economical and oddly elegant. The lemon sauce was what really set salmon loaf apart. It was tangy, buttery, and slightly sweet, and it made the dish from a budget meal to a Sunday special. Don't be fooled by the canned salmon. This dish was full of protein, omega-3s, and enough nostalgia to take you straight back to Grandma's kitchen. Salmon loaf became a hit during the Great Depression and World War II because it was an inexpensive way to stretch ingredients. It was surprisingly versatile, plus it would be good for Sunday supper or cold the next day with a salad. The kind of dish that made you feel fancy without spending a fortune. Salmon loaf is long gone from today's menus, but it's a reminder of just how resourceful home cooks were back then. If you're a little adventurous or just nostalgic, give it a whirl. You never know, you might have a new old favorite for your Sunday table. Back in the day, ham mousse might sound like the punchline to a retro food joke, but it was the height of sophistication. Picture this. It was pale pink mousse, quivering ever so slightly in a gelatin mold, surrounded by a fancy garnish of parsley or maybe even radish roses. The kind of dish you'd see at a mid-century ladies' luncheon or a formal Sunday spread. To make ham mousse, you'd first puree ham with mayonnaise, cream, and seasonings like mustard or Worcestershire sauce. The mixture was then poured into a gelatin-lined mold and chilled until set. The result? A salty, creamy spread that was perfect with crackers, celery sticks, or rye toast. Ham mousse is a little odd by today's standards, but it was a marvel of ingenuity. Even leftover ham had a second life as a party centerpiece in a time when nothing went to waste. Plus, gelatin molds were all the rage, and if you didn't have at least one on the table, were you even hosting? Ham mousse is a quirky piece of culinary history, and these days it's more likely to get laughs than admiration. But that's just how it goes. It's sure to be a conversation starter at your next gathering. Try it out. Let's start with a dish that might sound like a dare. Beef tongue stew. I can tell you before you wrinkle your nose, this was the kind of meal that made families sit up and ask for seconds. Beef tongue simmers low and slow with onions, carrots, and potatoes, becoming tender slices of savory goodness. Pot roast with a little extra, wow, really? On the side, basically. The beef tongue was a budget-friendly protein back in the day and didn't skimp on flavor. When you were trying to stretch a meal without sacrificing heartiness, it was a kitchen MVP for Sunday suppers. The trick was boiling the tongue until tender, peeling off the outer skin, not as gross as it sounds, I promise, and letting the tongue soak up the rich, brothy stew. When people started preferring pre-packaged convenience over kitchen craftiness, this dish fell off the map. Beef tongue stew is a culinary throwback, but if you can find a tongue at your butcher or muster the courage to try one, then it's worth exploring. It's earthy, tender, and the sort of meal that makes you feel tied to a simpler, thriftier time. Who knows? It could become your next Sunday's favorite. If fried cornmeal mush isn't your thing, you obviously haven't ever had it fresh from a skillet. Sunday morning classic, hot and drizzled with syrup. This golden, crispy on the outside, soft on the inside dish was a golden. Imagine it as the rustic cousin to pancakes. Simple, hearty, and oh so satisfying. Mush was made of humble cornmeal cooked into a thick porridge, poured into a loaf pan, cooled, sliced, and fried to perfection. This was a family staple in the early 20th century as a way to stretch budgets. Cheap, filling, and adaptable, corn could be made into bread or fritters. Fried mush with syrup? That was the weekend treat. Its versatility made it so special. It was served sweet by some families, and others topped it with gravy for a savory twist. Either way, it was the best comfort food. And the crispy edges? Absolute heaven. Fried cornmeal mush is a nostalgic gem that you have today, and it should be on your breakfast table. Try it yourself. Dust off your cast iron skillet, and you'll see why generations before us couldn't get enough of this crispy, syrup-soaked delight. Onion pie doesn't sound like a headliner, but this savory masterpiece was a Sunday supper hero in its day. A humble but luxurious dish of caramelized onions, rich cream, and flaky crust came together in layers. This was the kind of meal you closed your eyes and savored every bite. This pie wasn't only delicious, it was practical. Onions were cheap, easy to store, and full of flavor, so they were a staple ingredient for frugal home cooks. Simple pantry staples were often enriched with eggs, cream, and a dash of nutmeg or cheese, making it feel like something special. Savory tarts were a common way to showcase vegetables, and onion pie's roots can be traced back to European cooking, especially in Germany and France. Immigrants brought the idea to America, and it became a comforting staple in farming communities where onions were plentiful. Onion pie has all but disappeared from today's dinner tables, but it's worth rediscovering. Serve it with a fresh green salad or alongside roasted meats for a Sunday supper that's as timeless as it is delicious. Trust me, this pie is not boring at all. It's a flavor bomb in disguise. Spam casserole might not have been glamorous, but it was a Sunday night legend. Picture this: cubes of Spam layered with creamy mushroom soup and crushed crackers baked until bubbly and golden. The meal was salty, savory, and the kind of meal that made everyone forget they were eating canned meat. Mid-century families found Spam to be the ultimate convenience food. It was introduced during World War II and quickly became a pantry staple, especially in the South. It was the perfect way to stretch it into a hearty meal that fed a crowd in a casserole. Canned green beans or a sprinkle of cheddar, and you had a dish that felt like a celebration. Spam casserole was so iconic because it was so simple. There were no fancy ingredients, no complicated steps, just a can opener, a casserole dish, and a little creativity. It also had that irresistible combination of crispy topping and creamy filling that made casseroles so popular. Spam may not be as cool as it once was, but this casserole is a sentimental nod to a simpler time when families conjured magic from pantry staples. Bring out your retro recipe cards and give it a go. Who knows? It might just win you over. Pineapple and cheese casserole might sound like an identity crisis, but I promise it works. A combination of sweet pineapple chunks, shredded cheese, buttery crackers, and a hint of sugar made for an unexpectedly addictive flavor combo. It's like your grandma's kitchen all of a sudden decided to have a party without you. Sunday suppers often featured this southern favorite alongside baked ham. The casserole's sweet and tangy notes paired well with the saltiness of the ham, and it was a hit at family gatherings and potlucks alike. It was one of those is it a side or a dessert dishes that people would come back for seconds on. The origins of this quirky casserole are murky, but that's the southern way of taking oddities and turning them into culinary gold. Cheese and pineapple? Sounds weird, tastes amazing. But add a crispy cracker topping and you've got a dish that is part comfort food and part conversation starter. Pineapple and cheese casserole may have fallen from the mainstream menu, but it's time to bring it back. Bring it to a potluck and serve it at your next holiday meal, but be prepared to explain why this unlikely pairing works so well. Spoiler, it's magic. Deviled eggs are retro, but how about sardine stuffed eggs? The hard-boiled eggs stuffed with a creamy yolk mixture spiked with mashed sardines were the ultimate Sunday supper appetizer. Before we knew what umami was, it was salty, savory, and packed with umami. During the early to mid-20th century, sardines were a pantry staple. Cheap, nutritious, and easy to store, they were a go-to ingredient for thrifty home cooks. A clever way to take a simple dish and make it special was to mix them into deviled eggs. Plus, sardines gave a briny kick that complemented mustard and paprika. This was not just practical, it was a crowd pleaser. Sardine stuffed eggs were the kind of appetizer that would get people talking, whether served at church socials, family gatherings, or Sunday dinners. And eating. A lot. They might sound like a hard sell today, but don't knock them until you try them. The health benefits and bold flavor of sardines are having a bit of a renaissance. Make a batch of these retro gems and you might even convert the pickiest eater at the table. You'll at least get major nostalgia points. Scrapple is the answer if you've ever wondered what happens to all the pork parts nobody wants to talk about. This zero-waste dish is the ultimate pork scraps, cornmeal, and spices combined into a savory loaf that's sliced and fried until crispy. Scrapple is Pennsylvania Dutch kitchen hailing, designed to stretch a small budget and a whole hog. It's got the texture of a crisp-edged pancake and the heartiness of sausage, making it great for breakfast or dinner. Hot, with a drizzle of maple syrup or a dollop of apple butter is best, though the purists say that ketchup is the only way. One of Scrapple's biggest charms is its versatility. You can eat it sweet, savory, or somewhere in between. Its name doesn't exactly roll off the tongue as gourmet, but Scrapple has a rustic appeal that has kept it alive in some corners of the country. For some, it's nostalgic. For others, mysterious. But it's definitely food with a story to tell. Scrapple, though it's not so much a thing these days, deserves a comeback, if only for its use of everything but the oink. It's a poor man's pâté or an ancestor of food sustainability, but it's proof that resourcefulness can be delicious. Yes, you read that right. This sounds like a dare, but it was once a quirky staple in Depression-era kitchens. Simple, affordable ingredients, cabbage and peanut butter rolls, were combined in a way that's unexpected but also surprisingly delicious if you give it a chance. Here's how it worked. Blanched large cabbage leaves were then spread with creamy peanut butter. The leaves were rolled up tight like little cabbage burritos and baked to soften and meld the flavors. The result? Oddly satisfying and packed with protein, a savory sweet combo that was perfect for families scraping by. Peanut butter was filling and hearty, and cabbage was cheap and plentiful, so everyone could get through another long day. In fact, some recipes included a drizzle of molasses or honey for extra sweetness. When times were tough, creativity like this filled plates and bellies. It may not sound like a five-star dish. Today, these rolls might be a curiosity, but they are a testament to the ingenuity of past generations. You may not see cabbage and peanut butter rolls on any menus these days, but there's no reason they couldn't be an oddball appetizer at your next retro dinner party. It'll be a conversation starter at least, if nothing else. Mock turtle soup is not for the faint of heart or the literal-minded. Real turtle soup was a delicacy that most people couldn't afford in the 1800s, and this dish grew out of that. A budget-friendly stand-in that would enter the calf's head, a gelatinous texture and deep flavor of turtle meat. Yes, you read that right, calf's head. Mock turtle soup was a process. The meat was boiled, the head boiled, to extract every ounce of flavor, and then chopped bits of meat, sometimes including the brain and tongue, were added to the broth. It became a rich, savory stew with the help of spices, sherry, and a bit of lemon juice. And somehow, it worked. Those who wanted to feel fancy without actually having to shell out for real turtles made this a Sunday staple. It even made its way into pop culture, most notably in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, in which a character called the Mock Turtle complained about his existence. The idea of boiling a calf's head may not win hearts today, but mock turtle soup was the epitome of resourcefulness and culinary creativity. Once the stuff of luxury on a budget, it's a meal that proves ingenuity could make even the most esoteric ingredients unforgettable. Oxtail pie is the answer if you've ever thought, what part of the cow haven't we eaten yet? Rich and comforting, this old-school dish makes the humble cow tail into a meal. High collagen in oxtails gives the meat a lot of flavor, and when slow-cooked low and slow, the collagen creates a silky, unctuous texture. In order to make this pie, the oxtails were simmered for hours with onions, carrots, and celery until the meat practically came off the bone. The tender morsels were then nestled into a pie crust, covered with a golden pastry lid, and baked to perfection. The result? So hearty and satisfying a meal that could fortify anyone for a week of hard work. Thrift wasn't the only thing about oxtail pie. It was about getting the most flavor out of it. The long cooking process pulled out an almost velvety richness that made what had been a throwaway cut into a real delicacy. Oxtail pie is a rarity today, but the flavors are unforgettable. This dish is a tribute to the art of turning humble ingredients into something extraordinary, whether you're a fan of nose-to-tail dining or just love a good meat pie. When the cupboard is empty and the woods are near, squirrel fricassee is the Sunday supper of last resort. The only thing I can say about this dish is that it managed to make the squirrel taste like something not too far from, well, edible. The squirrel's skin was removed. The bodies were washed and cut into portions which were fried in butter on a pan. After that, they were stewed in a creamy sauce with onions, garlic, and a hint of nutmeg, or parsley. Served over rice or biscuits, it was the kind of dish that could go a long way to changing the most cynical of a person's mealtime expressions into a grin of equal proportion and spoon-plunging motions. Fricassee wasn't only about sustenance indeed, squirrel fricassee was about inventive thinking. During the years of the Soviet Union, squirrels populated the forests of rural areas, and numerous children were hunting for them as a part of the initiation process. Also, the gray, stringy substance within the tubes was a dietary protein when meat from young animals was unavailable. Though squirrels are not in fashion today, the preparation known as squirrel fricassee is evidence of how those of the earlier generations lived and what they could give themselves to. Maybe it won't ever return to your dinner plates, but it offers a glimpse into what people will do to make a tasty meal even when the main ingredient is animals from the backyard. Boiled salt pork with parsnips is comfort food in the same way a hug from a grandmother or a grandfather figure would be. This dish came into being due to circumstances, but it was sufficiently savory to become a Sunday meal. Salt pork was cured and full of flavor. Once boiled, it lost its salty taste, and it was served with parsnips, which are sweet root vegetables that can grow in even the harshest of climates. The beauty of this dish was its simplicity. The salt pork gave the broth a very rich, savory taste, and the parsnips gave the meal a natural sweetness. Occasionally, potatoes or carrots were added to the mix in order to make the dish go even further. This meal was not just a meal in the normal sense of the word because it was a time to maximize what was available. Salt pork was also preserved well and could be stored in the pantry, without refrigeration, when fresh meat was a rarity. Parsnips could withstand the worst of the winters and hence were not a bad bet for farmers who grew them. Boiled salt pork with parsnips does not sound like a gourmet dish today, but it is a dish with a long history and an eye to the practicalities of feeding a household. It's a meal that teaches us that sometimes the simplest of ideas and the most basic of ingredients can produce something far more than the whole. A perfect slice of America. Journey cakes, Johnny cakes, whatever ancient name you know them by, this is another example of Americans trying to keep the love of sausages alive by putting new spins on dishes. Sometimes they were new ones. Sometimes they were ones that already existed for a while. A lot of people were pretty familiar with Johnny cakes already, but the sausage version was something that was made by the people of North America. They started off with the indigenous communities over there, and ground corn was a big part of their daily routine. They started using ground corn to make these flatbreads, which were the basic breakfasts in North America. Eventually, farmers started getting their hands on a bit more pork than before, and thus sausages were brought into the mix. It's really a great lunch or breakfast, doesn't bloat you, doesn't leave you running close to empty still, and feels great while tasting delicious. People kind of debate where the name came from, though. There wasn't really a Johnny that made this dish popular, nor was there any kind of historic or iconic journey that it was popular with. I guess maybe you could call it an offshoot of Jonakin, which was a New England term that was used for cornmeal cakes and the like, but then again, it's not really the same. Either way, what we're concerned about is how it takes a sausage and makes it shine. It didn't start out this way, as in the North it was really just more corn than sausages. When it hit New England, it was a breakfast meal that would come with molasses or syrup. In the South, you'd instead have cornmeal pancakes, and over time, more and more breakfast items kept getting tacked onto the dish until we hit sausages. Baked seven beans are a casserole dish that actually does stay very true to the name. They use about 7 different types of beans, and all of that comes together for one massively satisfying combination of flavors. Basically, if you're a big bean fan, then this dish is nirvana to you. It was widely considered to be the peak of what baked bean dishes could be back then, and for good reason too. Kidney beans, navy beans, butter beans, black, lima, and pinto beans. They had literally almost every kind. The beans would then be mixed with ketchup, brown sugar, mustard, bacon, and another heavy hitter of the 20th century, molasses. Sweet and smoky, slightly tangy, each bean had its own texture and incredible flavor. It was a dish that more than anything else would fill you up to the brim, though. which is why it was so popular for grandmas to make it as a family dish that could feed everybody and still have leftovers. Strangely enough, though this sounds like a really old classic, it only came into existence around the 1970s when people started pushing for more creativity in their food. And as you can see, whoever came up with this definitely understood the assignment. Big Mama's Egg Pie. Funny name, right? A lot of people think the title came from the rural South. There, the mom of the family was often always in charge of deciding how the family would eat, a lot more so than other communities. They became known affectionately as Big Mamas, and it was a pretty cute honorific for Southern Black families. That's how they'd refer to the grandma or the eldest woman in the family who would cook all the delicious things you guys grew up on, like this pie here. When the Great Migration happened and those communities first flocked to America, they brought over a slew of family-friendly recipes with them, this egg custard pie being one of them. I didn't really get it either until I found out the history behind egg pie and how it's a staple of Southern homes. Basically, if you live up there, you've been around the block with this pie a few times. The custard eggs really need to be whisked properly to get it right though, but that's something grandmas, or as this dish would refer to them, Big Mamas were pretty well acquainted with. The best thing about custard pies was probably how easy it was to make them, which is also how they ended up getting so popular in the first palace. The ingredients were something you'd find around anywhere, really. You don't get a gray hair cooking food for a family on a yearly basis and come out of it with no tricks with basic things. I don't really know what the trend was, assuming that mothers as a collective were tied to these dishes. But Grandma Dallie's honey granola is as much of a vintage family recipe as it gets. The dish is also insanely healthy, and it shows how seriously Americans started taking their eating towards the end of the 20th century. Honey granola used honey nuts, oats, dried fruit, and a lot of toasting in the oven. It started to evolve into a homemade meal, and people started to customize it more and more with nuts, seeds, dried fruit, and every other thing they could get their hands on. Your grandma's gingerbread pancakes were a very special type of spiced pancake that had flavors like ginger and cinnamon, plus molasses too. You could think of it as like a spicier pancake or gingerbread, though gingerbreads themselves have been around for ages, with popular meals like gingerbread houses being the pride and joy of both cooks and Khazid across many countries, especially the USA. This fusion of both gingerbreads and pancakes happened as a result of fusion food culture in the 1930s to 1970s. People loved to mix and match pre-existing dishes to create wacky combos, and sometimes you got pizza burgers, which weren't really that much of a hit, and sometimes you got gingerbread pancakes. It was like Russian roulette, but with food, and despite how these only came around in the middle of the 1950s, they really held their own. It became something that families could enjoy on a budget because it really didn't take anything. But it was a recipe that was in its glory days during the start of the 19th century. That's why only grandmas and the like remembered it. It has all the sweetness of a regular pancake, but it has a slightly spicier aftertaste too, thanks to the cinnamon and ginger. Another classic of the 90s that came right from the kitchens of grandmas all over was fried catfish with hush puppies. This is again something that'll take us right to the heart of Southern cooking if we eat it. Along those rural places near rivers, lakes, ponds, and other bodies of water where you could find fresh catfish in abundance. Hush puppies were something made with fried cornmeal batter and were a popular dish to give to soldiers during the Civil War, so all in all, this dish was really light money-wise. Some basic Cajun spices or a Southern spice blend would make it even better into a real full-fledged meal that you could eat in comfort with the family. While it's been a big part of Southern cooking ever since the 19th century, it arguably had its biggest glory days in the 20th one as part of Southern soul food. There was a time in the 30s to 40s where soul food started to get into more and more menus across several places in the South, which wasn't always the case. Thank God it did though, because steamed catfish definitely doesn't hit the spot quite like fried ones do with some golden brown hush puppies. We're going to go forward in time a bit, all the way to the beginning of what most people consider the late 20th century, where stuffed zucchini boats first started becoming something you would hear about regularly. You know, at bars, from your friends and colleagues, or your partners. They became really hot in the 60s and 70s when it felt like everyday people were trying another dish from a new country that hadn't really touched base in America yet. It was the first time people expanded their taste buds beyond the bacon, pancake, and hash brown breakfasts they were mostly used to. Plus, stuffed zucchini boats were really healthy. They were a lot better to eat than those aforementioned breakfasts. The best part was that you could really change up the fillings, so depending on what you wanted, you could have fully vegetarian zucchini boats or ones with ground beef stuffings. People say this is a part of Italian-American cooking, but a lot of Mediterranean cooking makes use of dishes similar to zucchini boats, like using stuffed peppers and vegetables like eggplants. Coconut chiffon cakes. These started becoming popular in the late 1920s, and the earliest reference I could find was of Harry Baker, who kept a secret recipe for 20 years before it finally became public in the 1940s. Before he decided to share his secrets with the wider world, most cakes were pretty heavy and required a lot of batter. That wasn't really to the liking of the upper class, especially when we talk about Hollywood stars who Henry was known to work for. They preferred foreign styles of making cakes, and especially in Europe, chiffon cakes were really popular. Henry got a solid grip on the dish because he prepared so many of them for their special events, and eventually, he developed a perfect recipe that even General Mills had their eye on. When they did get it, they started promoting it in their Betty Crocker recipes, which was a surefire way to bring the cake into the mainstream. That's some real commitment to the bit. But his recipe was sought after because even despite how chiffon cake is naturally a pretty light and airy cake, his was like a floating cloud with the best parts of coconut milk and extract. Also, the shredded coconut on top and the cream of tartar really gave it that finishing touch. If we move on over to the south for a bit, we're going to find that these people dearly love their potato salads. Who can blame them? Region to region, there's no family that doesn't have a deep, intimate relationship with the potato. Arguably one of the finest things to ever come out of Mother Nature, and especially was Grandma buttermilk syrup. It took a tangy, sweet syrup that used buttermilk, sugar, vanilla, and made a tangy syrup which wasn't overbearing with its sweetness. It started off as this dish that became a rural area-only thing, because the syrup itself was something you could get a lot of mileage out of even if you were stepping away from making pancakes for a bit. And hey, it happens, you can't always chow down on the same thing again and again without something new to keep you excited and on your toes. Plus, some people just lived real far away from any store that had pancake syrup pre-made, and for them, this buttermilk recipe was a savior. Grandma Cheryl's bagels are some of the best bagels you can find. Getting tired of the greasy street ones that don't ever seem to do the trick? Forget those, this is the real deal, right from the cookbooks of 1,000 grandmas you'll never meet, but with all the ingenuity and love that they put in their cooking. It's most popular in Jewish communities because the very first Jewish immigrants from Europe actually brought it over with them. We aren't really sure if there was an actual Cheryl among them who made this dish into what it is today, but what I do know is that there is a lot of community love for this dish. It became known specifically for its softer texture. Most bagels in that era were really stiff, and the pastry was really chewy. In Jewish communities in particular, there was a lot of love for that aspect of the dish. They loved softer bagels that were different from the street-style ones you would usually find. It's not often you get to have such a nice, new, and fresh take on bagels, but when you do, it makes for a great dish. Speaking of something right out of Great Britain that got a lot of traction in Uncle Sam's backyard, bread and butter pickles were another one on this list that I'm a little sad over. Not because I can't make them, but because you kind of had that social aspect of bonding over a shared meal of bread and butter pickles, or really, anything on this list. It's just not enjoyable in the same way anymore, you know? The thinly sliced cucumbers, the brined onions, the impeccable mix of vinegar, sugar, mustard seeds, and turmeric, and then those fresh, amazing pickles. It had all kinds of tastes, but they seemed to be working as a team, not fighting for the center stage. It meant that everything about this dish complemented the flavors it was going for. The sugar from the brine helped balance the tanginess of the vinegar, which in turn also helped the pickles be less sour and easier to eat. This is something we've had since the 20th century, and it's actually thought that two farmers from Illinois, Omar and Cora Fanning, who first started selling pickles during the Depression, are the ones who popularized it. They would trade jars of pickles for bread and butter. And that's kind of how the combination started being a mainstream preference and classic in the first place. I know these two words next to each other might be confusing at best and food blasphemy at worst to a lot of you. Parents baked ziti, especially if you have some Italian roots, and if you do, then you share that in common with this dish. Right from the streets of Italy, immigrants first brought this dish over in the middle of the 19th century throughout the early start of the 20th one, so it had a lot of time to become something that people could love and associate with the finer things in life. People had a lot of time by the mid-20th century to try this dish, and plenty of families had passed their own secret baked ziti recipes down. The baked ziti really hit its highest highs during that time period in the 1950s to the 1970s, and it was something you could enjoy at both a potluck and a fancy at-home date. It was a staple of Italian-American cooking, and you could even find it at weddings. I, for one, think that really speaks to how popular the dish was, but what's your experience with this dish? And if you don't have any yet, is it something you'd ever try out? Now here's something that started out in the bleakest of times but quickly became a sensation throughout America even after the Great Depression ended. You can't ever beat a fried bologna sandwich. I don't care what uptown neighborhood and what fancy restaurant you've been to. Something about that mix of bologna with cheese, mayo, and sometimes even bacon and sausages is unbeatable. It was something that was incredibly beloved by the public right after the Second World War ended, and the Midwest in particular couldn't really ever get enough of it. Diners, homes, rural areas, local breakfast joints, everyone was serving an affordable fried bologna sandwich. It was something you could rely on to both satisfy your taste buds, get you a healthy dose of protein, and not break your wallet if you had it daily, which was really asking for a lot in those times. Speaking of those times, another really good source of protein was catfish, and one of the best ways to have it, stuff like wild rice with mushrooms, for example, made the best out of ingredients that nature and the environment would provide for you almost year-round. It's only after the 2000s that there's been this much of a focus on stores being your one-stop solution to everything and having every product under the sun shelved and stocked, but before, it really didn't used to be like that. Wild rice was really native to the Great Lakes region, for example, and it was really common for Native American tribes to be harvesting it and trading it. It was seen as a great alternative to normal white rice since it had a new texture that, when it was first introduced, people weren't too used to. It also had an amazing earthy taste that worked way better than plain rice ever did. That's why it went so well with wild mushrooms and some basic seasonings. A lot of these dishes focused on drawing out the flavor that was already there in the ingredients instead of mixing up 30 of them to get one TikTok-worthy cheese dish. That'll get you clicks and views, but these were the kinds of dishes that made memories. The kind of stuff people start thinking about when they get nostalgic about their youth. It's sad that thanks to inflation and changing tastes, which now gravitate towards more mainstream grains, dishes like these eventually became lost to time. Speaking of things that went into irrelevance because of the tide of the times, especially when you make a shout hallelujah potato salad. Before you ask in the comments, I'm just as lost as you on where they came up with the name. I mean, maybe they were Jeff Buckley fans? Side note, I really hope you get the reefer either way. This salad really did want to make you yell hallelujah, so there is that. It just isn't very often that you come across a salad that has it all, you know? The taste, the binge-eating potential, the perfect texture, and the health benefits. This one takes hard-boiled eggs, scallions, paprika, mayo, and potatoes, and a pretty tangy dressing. This is one of those dishes that German immigrants first brought over with them, and I'm personally glad they brought the best of their kitchens. All in all, if you're trying to find a new way to have a delicious salad, this is definitely the best thing on the market. It'll get you feeling fuller and healthier, and it's a lot better than a greasy street-side sandwich which your doctor may be recommending you to eat a lot less of. Speaking of comfort food that doesn't ever really get old, let's talk about big cucumber salad and sour cream was a simple but effective mix to go for if you were feeling like a low-key salad that didn't take a lot of effort. As much as I vouch for orzo salad and similar things, they do need a lot of prep work, and salads themselves don't really give you a shot of energy solid enough to pass your entire day with, so you end up eating more or ordering out anyway. That's why it's important to have salads like these, which actually save time, costs, and stamina by being ridiculously easy to prepare. All you need is to slice up some cucumbers real thin, mix it with a dressing made of vinegar and sour cream, and then just add some herbs for flavor. Voila! You're literally done. This was a popular snack or breakfast in Scandinavian cuisines, and it was brought on over as immigrants continued to migrate to America as they built communities and spread their roots and culture around. Cucumber salad was a refreshing side dish that worked the best to take that summer edge off, which is something we need now more than ever before, really. I mean, how is it this hot in November? While salads are all ideal picnic material, what about when you really need that extra energy, like we were just talking about? Sometimes healthy eating doesn't really cut it. I mean, it's great for your body, but not so much for the soul, you know? A strawberry pretzel Jell-O salad. Let's take a look at this dish. It's definitely a big part of what you would call retro American culture, and it was very common during wintertime holidays and potlucks. It's really important that you let each layer of this rest and set properly because it's not just an assortment of veggies you can toss in and mix. The pretzel crust, the cream cheese, the Jell-O layer, and the base all need to be set properly before the next one's added and chilled. It sounds like a lot of work, but I promise you, it really is an experience. I guess the saddest part about this dish is that it's completely a forgotten memory in the history of American cookbooks now. There was time in the middle of the 1900s that was really characterized by one thing and one thing only: creativity. You might be surprised to hear a salad like this exists, but back then people were making all kinds of colorful layered dishes that had explosive flavor profiles and would never shy away from the flavors their ingredients presented. Healthier versions of this salad used things like sugar-free Jell-O, but it was never really a dish that was healthy to begin with. It was one of the best things to throw at a birthday party or for a cookout when you needed a break from the pork and the beef. American rice pilaf is traditionally made with some long-grain rice and thin noodles like vermicelli or orzo. The broth is made with vegetables and chicken, and the seasonings are pretty basic, but people did use allspice pretty often. It's a really aromatic dish, and it has a lot of buttery undertones thanks to the fat that they use in the cooking. The rice also turns out really fluffy, but it absorbs some of the sweetness of the noodles. This is one of those dishes that again got to us from other countries and distant shores, but when it did touch American soil, it was here to stay. This time, you can thank Middle Eastern and Mediterranean traditions, especially Armenians, for bringing this dish and making it as popular as it is. It's long been an accompaniment, but when it started getting into its glory days, it was even made as a main dish, though then people would use more spices to provide an edge in terms of flavor. If you talk about it as a side, though, it works amazing with stews and curries. For those of you who watch Studio Ghibli films, think about the plates of curry and rice you see sometimes being cooked up in them. It's kind of like that, and I don't know about you, but that just screams comfort to me, which is something a lot of people could use more and more in this fast food-dominated brand-eat-brand world. Speedies are also something you would find at gatherings for family or just friends, mostly because no party is complete without a good platter of meat skewers going around a few drinks. So, mostly people would enjoy these most when the meat was lamb, but some areas like California would use chicken or beef too. It was really the grilling where the magic happened. These plates of Speedies set the mood in a party alight. It was a taste that, when they experienced it, people at a party knew that they were in for a really good time. The kind of dish that gets a crowd excited and hungry. There were even Speedafests in Binghamton and all around New York in general. It was a part of the local culture that no big celebration was really complete without. The reason it got popular wasn't just because of a regional preference in New York, though. The dish was bold, tangy, and citrusy, and it could double as an amazing sandwich too. You would find these in street stalls throughout New York, as well as at homes, but nowadays the dish has faded away into irrelevance. I don't need to tell you about how much America and the West in general love BLT egg bakes, but it really wasn't easy for them. BLTs were something that got so deeply ingrained into the culture of America that breaking up with them was an actual struggle. You know how you change your dog's favorite food because, well, it might taste good, but it gives him a lot of vet runs down the line? Or how you have to change your favorite snack because the other one's just too bad for your teeth or something? Letting go of this baked egg casserole was hard, man. The BLT sandwich has a lot of history. It goes back to the start of the 1900s, and it was one of the first simple American sandwiches that people started playing with. Egg casseroles and bakes, on the other hand, would become a mainstream home chef classic in the 1950s and 60s, where there was just a large focus on bakes and egg-based dishes. It's because they were so easy to prepare that they got as popular as they did. They also worked the best with sandwiches, so it seemed like that there was no avoiding the eventual fusion of these two dishes. So it happened that the BLT egg bake was eventually made, with all the comfort of a sandwich that you could have for lunch or breakfast, and all the crowd-filling capabilities of a baked egg casserole. It was a very flavorful, heavy dish that was a massively big upgrade from the canned, convenience-oriented cooking that the World War era brought on. Not all convenience food was bad, though. Some were the perfect thing for a party, and if you've ever had But hear me out. Seriously, just bear with me here. Pizza salad. You heard me right. Pizza and salad together in one, and yes, that is exactly what it sounds like. The flavor and essence of pizza are in the form and body of a salad. It took me a while to wrap my head around this one, and honestly, I'm still not fully convinced, so I wouldn't blame you. You've already made up your mind and are sitting on a strict no. But for what it's worth, as far as salads go, it's definitely one of the better ones out there. It uses cherry tomatoes, black olives, slices of fresh pepperoni, and cubed mozzarella cheese and tosses and mixes it in a vinaigrette dressing, which also makes use of croutons and red onions. Last but not least, it makes use of some peppers you might not be used to, like banana peppers. It's definitely an acquired taste and was a highlight of the 1980s and 1990s, which were kind of trying to explore more experimentative fusion food. But it didn't do so well because it was a little too controversial. Love rice pudding. It's been something that's helped rural and urban populations get through some disastrously tough times, as well as a warm memory from childhood for a lot of people. One variation of the classic rice pudding was a Swedish rice ring, which would mostly be served at Christmas or a family get-together, but it eventually extended into daily use too. The dish first started off as something you'd only find in Scandinavian communities, and they'd really make heaps of the stuff. Enough to go around a big family of 6 or 8 with a bowl for each, and it makes sense too since it was made using some pretty average ingredients. Stuff like rice, milk, and cream were all you needed to get a Swedish rice ring going. The way it differed from normal rice pudding is in how the dish was originally always made with some kind of spice and topped with fruit or served alongside jam. Later on, when it expanded past the Scandinavian locale and got adopted into widespread use, people started using nutmeg and cinnamon as well. Some scant cookbooks might still recall the dish and the times where it was a great comfort meal, but a lot of the new ones don't really remember it anymore. I'm betting you've never heard of orzo salad or pasta before. It's tossed with an entire roster of vegetables, so if you ever want to get your health up in, like, a matter of days, start making this religiously. Here, you got everything, and I mean everything. Just like baked 7 beans had almost any kind of bean you could name. That's common for dishes that were conceived or ones that became trendy during the 1970s. That decade was prolific if nothing else, and a lot of it was because it was considered one of the flashiest times for America as a country, not just in music, but in every regard. Orzo salad tries its hand at shaking things up by first making use of a variety of greens like tomatoes, cucumbers, red onions, basil, parsley, and bell peppers. It rounds things off with feta cheese or balls of mozzarella that are maybe a bit bigger than your fingertips, but that can be adjusted according to your preference. It's a surprisingly light dish, and it has a lovely cheesy taste and feel to it that makes everything click. Hoppin' John is a dish that has some pretty rich heritage. I'm talking about African, Caribbean, and Native American roots that all boil together in the melting pot known as the South, where it first started becoming really trendy. However, the origins of the dish are actually a bit darker than just a happy coincidence that somehow got into everyone's table. Though the people who were eating it happily wouldn't know, It was first created and brought over by enslaved Africans in the American South. It made use of African rice and pork, and yes, the best part of the dish were the black-eyed peas even in those times. Now, as far as the name Hoppin' John is considered, nobody really ever knew where it first came from, or if there was a John who made this dish and brought it into everyone's lives, but the first time this name was mentioned was in the 1840s in a print. If you were down in the South in African American communities during New Year, then you would especially see a lot of Hoppin' Johns everywhere. The aroma of those peas and the smoked pork wouldn't miss anyone's nose, as the scent carried for miles and miles away. It was eaten specifically on New Year's because it was a common belief that eating Hoppin' Johns would bring good luck to people if they ate it to start the year. If you went into any new year with such a good plate of food, I'd say your luck was already pretty good. So maybe it does work? Brown Betties were one of the most classic American desserts to ever grace the table of an American kid. Something that might be seen as an old-fashioned dessert now, but used to be the next best thing after an apple pie. The flavors of a Brown Betty usually come from the spiced apples and other fruit-layered dishes, which are really buttery. The sugary breadcrumbs on top give it a crunch, which really adds to the entire vibe of the Brown Betty. You're looking for a warm, comforting dish that gets you in a nostalgic mood. Something you can sit down with and enjoy bite for bite, not rush through. It's an experience that you want to savor, like an empty, windy street as you walk down by and enjoy it. The Brown Betty was definitely something that would get you up out into the street, whether you were going to visit your grandma's for an authentic pie or a nearby bakery to reminisce about childhood days. The earliest recipes you can find are the ones from 1866, but those are more like Apple Betties than the ones we're talking about. Either way, this dish has definitely evolved alongside the population, and those who grew up with it will remember it fondly. Are you a big fan of deli food? Deli meats, sandwiches, loaves, that kind of thing? If these meals stroke a nostalgic bone in your body, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell us in the comments below which one of these forgotten Sunday supper meals was your favorite back in the day.